Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Have you ever wondered why there are so many pubs in London, particularly here in the West End, called the Coach and Horses? Usually it's hand-wavily explained as harking back to the coaching era, and sometimes it's said that many of these pubs were former coaching inns. Perhaps we should define exactly what we mean by a coaching inn. Here in London, they would be the starting or ending point for long-distance journeys by coach to other towns and cities. The George in Southwark is London's best surviving example today. It has a large stable yard, a place to park the coaches. It would have had stabling for the horses and space inside to provide overnight accommodation for travellers. It's also situated on a major road leading into and out of London. Much of that is very different from how we see pubs with that name in London today. Often small, hemmed in on both sides, no room upstairs for accommodation other than maybe a small flat for the landlord, and certainly nowhere round the back to park a coach. Nor are they often on major coaching routes. So what's going on here? Why are there so many pubs in London called the Coach and Horses? Well, if nothing else, it's an excuse for another pub crawl. I'm going to visit all 6 Coach and Horses pubs in central London today to figure out why this name is so common and what that might be able to tell us about the history of London and its pubs. Pub number 1, the Coach and Horses, obviously on Wellington Street in Covent Garden. Cheers from the Coach and Horses on Wellington Street. This is a cracker of a pub, actually, considering we're right here in theatre land. Very independent feel, sort of an Irish pub feel to it as well. A little bit difficult to do many of the talky bits here. It's all very compact and surprisingly busy for just after midday on a Tuesday lunchtime. The bar counter is a hefty piece of wood with fielded panelling and rounded corners, and at a guess I would say it dates to the interwar period. The bar back is a plaster arch. Quite an unusual barback fitting there. It partly houses a very large whisky selection. That's possibly whisky with an E. It might veer a bit more Irish. I think it said there are 70 plus whiskies there. The ceiling has an embossed geometric pattern. I can't say I'm really a fan of the current pale turquoise paint scheme, but there's plenty of interesting stuff on the walls, prints, photos and so on to hide that. So this Coach and Horses is on Wellington Street here in Covent Garden. Wellington Street was originally named Charles Street and was first laid out as part of the original development of the Covent Garden area in the 1630s. Covent Garden is of course very much theatre land. The Theatre Royal on Drury Lane has been just round the corner from here since 1663, and the Royal Opera House, now called something like the Royal Ballet and Opera or some such, has been on this site quite close to here as well since 1732. Into that context enter the Coach and Horses here. The earliest written evidence of its existence that I could find is from the 1750s, that's Westminster licensing records. At least stylistically this looks like a Georgian building, relatively modest construction in stock brick, unadorned with stucco or any of the other fripperies that the Victorians like to slap on the front of their buildings. Just these humble flat brick arches over the windows on the upper floors. It's quite possibly had 1 or 2 rebuilds since then. The ground floor pub frontage is likely much later. Despite those likely rebuilds though, the suggestion is this pub has occupied this relatively small footprint throughout its history, part of this terrace with other buildings immediately adjoining. We can see Charles Street on William Morgan's map of 1682, which is probably before the pub existed, but we don't know for sure. Then on John Rock's map of 1746, roughly around the time, as far as I can tell, it was first established, and on Horwood's map of 1799, where the outlines of the individual buildings are made very clear. Throughout all of that time, it seems to me this pub has been part of this tightly packed terrace, never so much as a hint of an archway or an alley leading to a stable yard behind it. I really don't think this was ever a coaching inn. So why is it called the Coach and Horses? Just like today, the theatres were the big draw here. People needed to get to and from them, and in the 18th century, here on Charles Street, as it was known then, conveniently between these 2 theatres, there was a coach stand. We're talking about Hackney coaches here, the taxis of their day. Fielding's Guide to Hackney Coach Rates, published in 1786, is a useful reference here. It contains what the correct fare should be for journeys to popular destinations, starting at each of the different coach stands that were distributed across London and the surrounding area at that time. Looking at the index, there seem to be around 90 of these coach stands, and Charles Street here in Covent Garden is one of them. I think this is almost certainly why we have a pub called the Coach and Horses here. Here's a quick shot of what was on the bar, although they did have a couple of hand pumps. There was London Pride and one other. I decided, given the slightly Irish pub feel to this place, it would be appropriate to have a Guinness. Pub number 2, the Coach and Horses, obviously on Old Compton Street, corner of Old Compton Street and Charing Cross Road, here on the edge of Soho. It was even more difficult to do any filming, any talking to camera at this pub. It doesn't have any outside drinking space as far as I could tell, and it really is a tiny pub. Inside there was one other customer, 2 members of staff behind the bar who were very friendly and very chatty, but I just thought it would be a little bit of an intrusion to start talking to the camera while I was in there. I think this has had a relatively recent and quite major refit, and I'm not sure if any of these fixtures and fittings are more than a few years old. There's some nice tiling on one of these walls and some Shepherd Neame branded mirrors. All of that I think is very modern. The bar counter has some nice chunky carving. Again, I think it's very modern, but it's at least vaguely in the style you would imagine to find from that late Victorian period. This is actually a listed building and surprisingly old. Historic England believes its origins could be late 1600s, although of course much altered since then. Historic England say it was likely a residential house before conversion to a public house, and although once again we do have licensing records for a Coach and Horses on Compton Street going back to the 1750s, there was likely more than one in the 18th century. The earliest record I've seen, which I'm fairly sure relates to this specific Coach and Horses, is from a newspaper mention in 1793, at which time there were no fewer than 5 pubs called the Coach and Horses in this parish, St Anne's, which covers most of Soho. Little Compton Street at that time corresponds to this short stretch at the end of what is now Old Compton Street. Elsewhere, I've seen a date of 1734 cited for this pub. Anyway, I think we can all agree that it's an 18th century pub. Was it, however, a former coaching inn? Here on John Rock's map of 1746, we can see Charing Cross Road was at that time named Hog Lane, and that connected with this major coaching artery running east to west across London. That was formed of Oxford Street, Broad Street, St Giles and High Holborn. That whole route was certainly lined with coaching inns, and we've talked about some of those in previous videos. Coaches coming off that major route and wanting to head down into Westminster would have used Hog Lane. However, if we look at maps throughout the lifetime of the Coach and Horses, I don't get the sense the property ever had the sort of footprint you'd expect it to have for a coaching inn. No sign of anything like a stable yard directly attached to the pub. Here's William Morgan's map of 1682, possibly around the time the pub was built, although it may have been a residential dwelling originally. Moving on to John Rock's map of 1746, which doesn't give a lot of detail of individual building outlines, but you can see a couple of other nearby yards and alleyways, so presumably if this pub had a stable yard at that time, we'd see an outline of it. Here's Horwood's map of 1799, where there are individual building outlines, still no sign of a stable yard behind the Coach and Horses, but those other yards and alleys are again visible. Finally, this 1870s OS map with even more detail, once again no sense that this pub has ever occupied much more than roughly the footprint it has today. Note on that map you can see another pub marked with a PH, which was a coaching inn, I believe, a few doors up the road on what is now Charing Cross Road. It was called the Plough, and we have some detail of the site being converted to stabling in 1876 for Cross and Blackwell in this article in The Builder. They incidentally had a pickle manufactory nearby on Soho Square, where they apparently made some of their famous products like Piccalilli. The Plough is, I believe, portrayed in William Hogarth's painting Noon, part of his 4 Times of the Day series, located as it is next to the old French chapel here on Hog Lane. The other nearby alleyway in those old maps is Star Court, which still exists today, now renamed to Greek Court, and unusually, although it's a public right-of-way, it has a locked door at the end of it. This newspaper account of a fire in 1852 suggests that at that time some of the buildings on or near Star Court were stabling and even cowsheds, so perhaps that was some remnant of an even older coaching inn, the Star Inn perhaps. Anyway, throughout its entire history I've seen no evidence of anything like a stable yard directly attached to this pub, the Coach and Horses. I don't think it was ever a coaching inn. Could it, like the previous pub, have been next to a coach stand for hackney coaches? Alas, neither Compton Street nor Charing Cross Road, including its former guisers as Hog Lane and Crown Street, had coach stands, at least not at the time of Fielding's Guide in 1786. So I couldn't really come up with a satisfactory explanation here, and I think the name Coach and Horses may just be a reflection of all the passing coach traffic at this busy junction, or something like that. It's a Shepherd Neame pub today, and I had a half of Spitfire. Pub number 3, my favourite of the lot, the Coach and Horses on Greek Street. Cheers from the Coach and Horses on Greek Street. An iconic and very famous pub in London, the pub where famously Geoffrey Bernard would occasionally become quite unwell. I have covered this pub before in that video on Soho pubs. I think I probably actually gave it slightly short shrift. Back in those days I wasn't being quite so meticulous about talking about the architecture and the interiors, and it was a little bit more about its recent history, so I won't go over its fun history of the sort of 1940s as opposed to the 1990s again. Today I'm really here more to talk about its ancient history and why it is that it's called the Coach and Horses. But while I'm here, let's just savour the beautiful pub for a moment. A fantastic mixture of many different pub styles covering many of the different eras that we often talk about on this channel. It's predominantly an 1840s building here on the corner, although there has been a pub on this site of this name for much longer than that. We'll get back to that later. But the ground floor frontage is late Victorian, 1889, around about then. In particular, it has these very eye-catching, I think possibly Doric topped columns. These are cast iron columns running along all of the frontage. There's something like 13 of these in total. They're painted red and white today, black at the base, fluted at the stem, and with some quite nice ornamentation towards the top. Taylor Walker took over the pub in the 1930s, and you can see some of their livery in the form of a couple of lanterns on the outside of the pub, and the sort of foundation for much of the interior of the pub that we see today was laid in that era, the 1930s. So taking a look inside, that interwar period was possibly the last time that pubs were still divided inside, with that theme that was familiar from the Victorian period of a public bar, a private bar and a saloon bar. And we originally had those three distinct sections here at the Coach and Horses, at least in that 1930s refit. The public bar is the side that faces onto Greek Street. The saloon bar is the side that faces onto what is now called Romilly Street. And in between that would have been a section called the private bar. And all three of these would have had their own dedicated entrances at one time. Interestingly, the saloon and the private bar counters both sloped very much interwar in style. They both have spittoons at the base, and yet the public bar section, again that's the one facing onto Greek Street, does not have the spittoon around its base. So this is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. Their theory for this is that that was to allow bar stools to be placed around the counter in the public bar section, and apparently it wouldn't really be normal for bar stools to be present in a saloon bar or a private bar, which were considered the two slightly posher bits of the pub. The panelling around the walls is from that 1930s refit. All of the woodwork in here I think dates to that sort of era, and it's in a light oak. There was a later partial remodelling in the 1960s when Ind Coop took over from Taylor Walker, and that's when those signs in the bar back date to, although they are added into that original woodwork. So those signs saying Ind Coop, the name of the brewery, and two of their major products at the time, Double Diamond and Skull Lager, they date to the early 1960s. As well, at that time, as was often the case in the 1960s, the partitions were opened up at least slightly. They're still present, but they have openings inside which wouldn't have existed prior to the 1960s. One or two other things that the chap behind the bar very kindly pointed out to me. There are still original hand pumps. They're currently not in use, but they are very nicely preserved and still working, I believe. Are they possibly from that Ind Coupe era, early 1960s? Also, Norman, the famous former landlord, is still apparently a regular visitor, even though he's now well into his 90s. And he recently mentioned that he actually put some of the flooring down here. And if you look underneath, there is a patch where some mosaic tiling is starting to emerge. And I wonder if that's actually even late Victorian. It's hard to imagine that that would have been part of that 1930s refit. It doesn't really seem like it would go with that light oak panelling. This is yet another pub where I found Westminster licensing records going back to the 1750s, and some sources even claim that there has been a pub on this site of this name going all the way back to 1724. Again, unfortunately, I couldn't find a really clear-cut answer for why this is called the Coach and Horses. First of all, let's try and address whether or not it could ever have been a coaching inn. If we look at Hallward's map of 1799, that's one of the earliest maps where individual buildings are clearly delineated. It's really hard to get a sense that there was ever anything like an archway off the side leading through to a stable yard at the back, or any room for coaches to park, any of that kind of stuff. It was quite tightly packed with buildings either side, and as far as I can tell, has been throughout its history. Looking at Fielding's guide from 1786, for the Hackney coaches, although Greek Street is mentioned as a common destination, it doesn't appear in the list of coach stands at the back. Greek Street does get a mention in this early publication from 1715 as an example coach journey from Newgate. That's just next to Smithfield, and I think that has been interpreted by some pub historians as possibly suggesting that there was a shuttle route between the Coach and Horses here and Smithfield. I'm not convinced that was the case. I think the article here from 1715 was simply showing some example coach journeys that could be taken at that time that would have only cost a shilling. However, going back to Fielding's guide of 1786, there was a coach stand at St Anne's Church here in Soho. Now we have to remember Romilly Street here was originally called Church Street. We're at one end of it here at the Coach and Horses. The other end of that is St Anne's Church. There's this really nice engraving from 1810 which shows the view down Church Street as it was then. We would have had the Coach and Horses some way behind us looking towards St Anne's Church. It's a little bit different today because some buildings have been built directly in front of where the church is. So I wonder if the coach stand that was named St Anne's Church actually spread all the way down Church Street. And it's possible, we're really not that far away, that one end of it may have tailed into the Coach and Horses here. It's a Fuller's pub today. The staff behind the bar were incredibly friendly. We had a lovely chat about pub history and architecture and historic England and all sorts of stuff. Pub number 4, the Coach and Horses on Great Marlborough Street. This is the third Coach and Horses in Soho today, and I think the origin of the name here is going to be a bit easier, so hopefully we can move over this one a bit more quickly. Yet again, I found Westminster licensing records for it going back to the 1750s, and other sources have even earlier dates, possibly as early as 1711. I found a mention in a book about Sir Andrew Chadwick that he apparently bought the pub, or at least a perpetual annuity on it, whatever that means, in 1729. If these dates are true, it would have been present at the time of John Rock's map of 1746, here on the corner of Great Marlborough Street and Poland Street. As we've said, Oxford Street was at that time a major coaching route, and you can see there are various stable yards leading off it clearly marked out here on the map, which indicate either coaching inns that were still active at that time, or possibly in some cases vestiges of earlier ones that had been there previously. We can see here a Nag's Head stables as an example. However, the absence of any stable yard for the location of this pub, this Coach and Horses, suggests it was not a coaching inn at that time. Looking to our guides on Hackney coaches, both in Fielding's and in Carey's, we see Marlborough Street. I think the great part was occasionally dropped in that period, listed as a coach stand. And I think from the 1770s, much of the traffic heading to this coach stand might have been taking people to the Pantheon, which was initially a venue for high society gatherings, masked balls, concerts and operatic performances, that sort of thing. So I think again here we have a fairly clear-cut case that this pub was named the Coach and Horses because the street that it was on, possibly even immediately in front of the pub, there was a coach stand. It's a Greene King pub today. There really isn't much to say for itself in terms of the interior. Very, very modernised and really not much to look at. There were a couple of hand pumps on the bar, but both of them were not quite yet in service for the day, so I just went for a half of Guinness. Heading into Mayfair now, and this is pub number 5, the Coach and Horses on Bruton Street. And what an absolute mock Tudor delight it is. Cheers from the Coach and Horses on Bruton Street in Mayfair. Before we get into the history and why this is called the Coach and Horses, let's take a quick look at the pub in its current state. As I said, I think this is a charming little chocolate boxy bit of mock Tudor. It's from the 1930s and was built by W.M. Younger and Co., who were an Edinburgh-based brewery. And we have encountered their pubs at least once before in these videos. There was the Ship in Holborn. I'll put a link to that up there. There are very similar style stained glass windows here to those at the Ship. They include some of the brewery branding in them. A black and white timber frame effect to the first floor with some nice carving, nice patination in that wood. And then on the top of the building, a hipped roof with dormer windows. It's a very narrow pub building. It's squeezed onto this corner of these 2 lanes here in Mayfair, and that will actually give us a bit of understanding about why it is called what it is called, but we'll come back to that a bit later. Taking a little bit of a look inside, there is wood panelling, more of that sort of mock Tudor style. Nice frieze, nice bit of wood carving in the frieze. All of that, well, the entire building dates to the 1930s, but I think it is really quite charming. So why is this pub called the Coach and Horses? Well, yet again, I found Westminster licensing records going back to the 1750s, and camera's site suggests that it may have been first established here in 1738. Here's Bruton Street on Horwood's map of 1799, and you can see that the layout that the pub had at that time is remarkably similar to how it is today. Pay attention, however, to those 2 lanes either side of the pub that it forms the sort of corner of. Bruton Lane was at that time named Bruton Mews, and Barlow Place was at that time named Barlow Mews. A mews is almost always a street that is located close to some larger, grander houses where the stable blocks and or coachyards are. So it seems extremely likely that those 2 streets, Bruton Mews and Barlow Mews, were at one time stabling and coach houses for the big houses here in Mayfair. We are of course just around the corner here from Berkeley Square, which would have been a very grand address in its heyday, or still is today, and that would have required stabling blocks to serve it. It seems almost certain to me that this pub is called the Coach and Horses because it was at the end of a mews and at the end of a run of stable blocks and coach houses. In fact, 2 mewses in fact here. I'm not quite sure what the plural is for mews. And it's likely that the original clientele of this pub would have actually been the grooms, the stable hands, the coach drivers that worked in that mews, those 2 mewses for the big houses nearby. This pub gets a mention in the 1875 London and Suburban Licensed Victuallers, Hotel and Tavern Keepers Directory, a very important sounding volume. And just look at the number of Coach and Horses at that time. 55 of them, and that may not have even been an exhaustive list because that was only the people that signed up to that particular association. Greene King pub today. I went for a half of Greene King IPA. Pub number 6, still in Mayfair, Hill Street. Cheers from the Coach and Horses on Hill Street. You can probably see the sign up there. This building very possibly dates to the 1740s. It is a listed building. It's often cited as the oldest pub in Mayfair, and it's probably one of the oldest buildings in Mayfair. Although, of course, as always, for a pub of that sort of age, there have been some later alterations. The stucco is apparently an addition of the 1850s. Underneath that, it's red brick. This is also on camera's list of historic pub interiors. There is quite an unusual and eye-catching bar fitting, bar back / bar over fitting. It looks almost like the canopy from a 4-poster bed. Really quite unusual. I think it's partly housing or shielding, and probably not supporting because it doesn't look structural, the stairwell that is behind it, and there are similar sort of wood carving bits behind the bar, and I think much of that is quite possibly late Victorian. Cameras notes also say that some of the dado panelling around the walls looks like it could be old. That could also possibly be late Victorian. And then towards the back of the pub is a fireplace with a marble and wood surround, may also date from that era. I'm not sure I've ever been in here before, surprisingly. I thought I knew Mayfair reasonably well. For some reason I've always missed this pub, but I was quite taken with it. It is a surprisingly pubby pub, and it does remind me a little bit of some of those Belgravia pubs. Yet again, I found licensing records from Westminster dating this back to at the very least the 1750s, and in fact some other records also talk about it being earlier than that, quite possibly 1740s. Here is the immediate vicinity on John Rock's map of 1746, and I think the blank bits here suggest some of the surrounding streets were still being laid out at that time. But you can see the little block where the pub stands today, and that would tie in with that date that's cited elsewhere of about a 1740s establishment for this pub. It was actually quite typical in these London developments for the pub to be the first thing that was built, because that would provide food and drink to the labourers while they were constructing the rest of the street. The streets around the pub aren't yet named on that map of 1746 because they weren't yet laid out perhaps, but if we go forward to Horwood's map of 1799, you can see it is on the corner of Hayes Mews, which I believe is still the name that it has today. I think once again, like the case we saw over at Bruton Street, the reason this pub is called the Coach and Horses is because it lay at the end of a mews. The immediate vicinity of this pub would have been, yet again, stable blocks, coach houses for the big houses elsewhere in Mayfair. Its customers, in the early days at least, would very possibly have been the coachmen, the stable hands, the grooms of those stable blocks and coach houses. So despite what it says on Google Maps, this was absolutely never a former coaching inn. It is a Shepherd Neame pub today. I think again we have to draw attention to the fact this is a really quite a pubby pub. You would expect something here in Mayfair to have gone very, very gastro, but it felt wonderfully pubby when I went in there. I went for a half of Spitfire. I'll put the price down there. So there we have it, 6 pubs in London, all called the Coach and Horses. My best guess is that for 3 of them, that's because they were located near to Hackney coach stands, the taxi ranks of their day. A further 2 in Mayfair there were located at the end of Mews, where the coaches and horses for big houses nearby were kept. That only leaves that final one on the corner of Old Compton Street and Charing Cross Road, which is a little bit of a mystery, but possibly just relates to the fact that there was so much coaching traffic in the area at that time, with, as we said, some coaching inns nearby. I spotted this morning, I have just passed 10,000 subscribers, which is a real privilege, I think, that so many of you are tuning in to follow along with this talk of historic pubs. So many of you are like-minded and care about preserving these important cultural institutions. So thank you very much for all of those of you who have subscribed and are supporting the channel in that way. Really, really appreciate it. It's completely off topic and not related to this video, but having stopped doing filming, I think I'm now going to go to the Red Lion for a celebratory pint. The construction work here on Crown Passage seems to be never ending, but here I am at the Red Lion. Absolute heaven here, one of my favourite pubs, the Red Lion on Crown Passage in St James's. Not at all relevant to this video, but I just thought I'd sign off here so I could say cheers, and thank you very much for all of those of you who have subscribed. Really appreciate it. Hope you're still enjoying the videos, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.